Good afternoon and welcome to everyone who has joined us today. And thank you for joining us for the last session of our series, Can Do Chameleons, which is hosted by the Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care alongside the Adler Museum of Medicine. You know, chameleons have this unique ability in that they are able to adapt and change in order to better fit their complex environments. It is the necessity of this adaptability in a South African context that the series seeks to address. Many of the challenges impacting the South African health sector can be linked back to health systems. But where there are challenges, we also see opportunities. This series opens up conversations about future directions and opportunities for health system thinkers. We have held engaging discussions every second Wednesday. And in case you have missed any of these discussions, we will upload a recording onto our series website, Fitswetu. The website is intended as a learning repository with details of our speakers and their work, as well as recordings from previous webinar series. Please feel free to explore the site. The link is in the chat. So as a quick introduction, my name is Shayla Pillay. I am an academic support officer for the NMFC program and an academic advisor to various programs within the Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care. This week's topic focuses on how the Teddy Bear Clinic and the Children's Institute, or South African Child Guage, plays roles in enabling children to fulfill their place as valuable members of society, and how the latest children's rights research is accessible to key decision makers in government and society to promote evidence-based policy and programming. I'm joined today by my co-host, Nkanyezi Nkosi, who is a second-year HSS student, and I'd like to now welcome our two speakers, Dr. Shahida Omar and Laurie Lake. But first, Nkanyezi, will you take us through the logistics and introduce our first speaker for the session? Nkanyezi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shil. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nkanyezi, and I am a student of HSS. I'm doing my second year, and today we have two guests. The first one is Laurie Lake, who is a communications and education specialist at the Children's Institute at the University of Cape Town, where she plays a central role in the production of the annual South African Children Guage and convenes the Institute's child rights courses for health and allied professionals. She serves on the Advocacy Committee in the Department of Pediatrics and Child Health Priorities Executive Committee. She is an anthropologist by training and has a postgraduate diploma in higher education. She specializes in making complex ideas accessible to a wider audience and is interested in engaged scholarship that harnesses the power and resources of the university to promote children's rights, survival, and optimal development. Our second guest is Dr. Omar, who holds a BA in social work, a master's in mental health, a diploma in marriage guidance and counseling, forensic assessment of child victims of abuse, a doctoral thesis on young sex offenders. She has specialized in gender-based violence courses at Johns Hopkins University, and also through UNICEF and DSD. Dr. Umar has worked at the Johannesburg Institute for Social Services, PediMed Clinic in Pretoria, Parktown School for Girls, Center for HIV and AIDS, counseling at the Medical Research Institute, Johannesburg Association for Age and Childline in Gauteng. She has been working at the Teddy Bear Clinic for Abused Children since 2000 and is the Director of Clinical Services during this time. She has developed the professional standard of services offered by the clinic. She is well known and respected in the field. I'll now give the floor to Laurie if she is ready to present and talk to us and tell us more about her work.
Thank you. You surprised me. I was so sure I was going to go second, but absolutely delighted to be here and to have this opportunity to share the work of the Children's Institute. And in particular, I'm going to focus on two projects. The one is our flagship project, the South African Child Guage, and the second are our child rights courses for health and allied professionals. And as you said in the introduction, I'm really interested in how we can harness the power of the university by putting children's rights at the core of what we do. And I wanted to start with this quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, who was chair of the UN Commission that drafted the UN Declaration of Human Rights all the way back in 1948. And very often when we think about human rights or children's rights, we think about the rights treaties, we think about our own constitution. But what Eleanor was saying 10 years after the UN Declaration was first introduced, she made the following statement. Human rights begin in small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college she attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. And unless these rights have meaning there, they shall not have meaning anywhere. And without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. So at GCT, we have a set of goals that speak to social responsiveness within the university, ensuring that our research contributes to the public good and shares knowledge for the benefits of society, but also a very clear intention to foster in our students the civic literacy, knowledge and skills that are needed to build a more just, equitable and unified South African society. The South African Child Guage has been running since 2005. It's an annual review of the status of South Africa's children. And it's attempting to do three different things. First, it's attempting to mobilize the resources of the university to better understand and address challenges faced by South Africa's children. Secondly, it makes this evidence accessible to those people in government who are responsible for the design and delivery of services for children, to make sure that children's best interests are really foregrounded and seen as of paramount importance in policy and program development. And finally, it's also a resource that is used extensively by civil society to hold government accountable. So we're creating a resource that is designed to bridge those three different worlds. And as a result, we create a range of products. There's a report itself, which is rooted in the academic evidence, written in plain language. It's supported by a policy brief, an A1 poster, and in many years, we've also developed a range of child and family-centered materials to make sure the children themselves can engage with the content. But the Guage is also a process of engagement. We recognize quite early on that the challenges that face children in South Africa are complex challenges. They're not the domain of any single department or specific sector or discipline. And therefore, we need to stimulate engagement, not simply between the academic and policymaking worlds, but also within them. And we've structured a process of engagement from an initial round table through writing retreats and advisory committee meetings to really help us build relationships between researchers and policymakers, so that government is more appreciative of the evidence base and researchers start to be more attuned to the policymaking process in South Africa. The 2020 issue of the Guage focused on food and nutrition security, where we brought together over 60 contributors from 29 different disciplines to really shine a spotlight on child hunger and nutrition. And it was developed in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. So there was a real sense of urgency to the work, recognizing the disruption of essential services, the rise in prices and unemployment, and the very clear impacts that that was having on child hunger and food security. What we did with the publication is we chose to reframe child malnutrition, which is often seen as a neglected topic. It really gets people's backs up or animates civil society. And so we chose to adopt this concept of slow violence, which comes from the climate change or climate crisis field. And it speaks to a violence that often happens very, very slowly and out of sight. So what we see with child malnutrition is it's eating away at the developing body and brain in ways that are largely invisible until the damage has already been done. And we know that that damage, that cycle of malnutrition plays out across the life course and drives an intergenerational cycle of poor nutrition, ill health, and poverty. And this notion of slow violence also speaks to some of the structural drivers at play. So both the extreme levels of inequality in South African society, but equally the exploitative nature of the food system, which leaves families with very little leeway in terms of healthy food choices. The report lists 6 concrete recommendations for action, from investments in maternal health to improvements in infant and young child feeding practices, pulling that through into the early childhood development space, into schools, but also thinking about how can we protect children from harmful business practices, and particularly advertising that targets young people. And then a real need to expand the social protection net and to raise the child support grants value to bring it closer in line with the food poverty line. So as you can see, a range of different, very practical, concrete recommendations, and 3 guiding principles. The first, a call to intervene early, starting even preconception and then extending that investment in child and adolescent malnutrition all the way through into adolescence, and thinking about what platforms we use in order to reach children at different ages. The need to adopt a double duty approach that addresses both the burden of undernutrition and overnutrition. And then finally, this notion of putting children at the heart of the food system, and to ensure that their best interests are really foregrounded in our policy and programming, whether we're looking at healthcare services or the agri-food industry or jobs and social protection. And this notion of a child-centered food system has gained significant traction. And that's in part because we don't only produce the book, we have a very high profile launch bringing together key thought leaders in the field, and we use that to stimulate a national dialogue with really a really proactive media campaign. In the 2020 year, we worked with our authors to draft 9 opinion editorials and over 80 headlines in print and broadcast media. And in addition to that, we work proactively to put child nutrition on the agenda, both in terms of government forums, civil society organizations, and the academic space. And we were very excited to see that this notion of a child-centered food system has now been championed by the Healthy Living Alliance and a broader food justice coalition, which is recognizing that when we get things right for children in the nutrition space, we're getting things right for their families and for society. Yeah, so just a note that the Guage itself, we often think about it as an exercise in knowledge translation. But having sat at the center of this process for many years, I've also recognized that the process itself is generative, that when we bring together academics and policymakers and practitioners, we start to see things differently. We start to see the gaps and the blind spots and areas for further inquiry. I'm going to speak very briefly about our child rights education courses, because this is a different model for building a whole series of can-do chameleons. And we desperately need to build leadership for child health in South Africa. We run a child rights and advocacy course and a broader postgrad diploma in community and general pediatrics. And we're trying to develop pediatricians who are able to lead for child health at district level. They are capable advocates for child health. They recognize the value of intersectoral partnerships. They are committed to enhancing the quality of care, and in developing innovative systems responses to address the burden of childhood illness and injury within their particular catchment area. And for many of these students who've been trained clinically, in fact, they're all practicing doctors out in the field when they're on the course, this is really pushing them out of their comfort zone to look at children in different ways. The first cycle of engagement is really looking at the relationship between individual practitioners and children and their caregivers. There's very strong emphasis on participation, on consent to medical treatment. So really putting children and the child's voice at the center of our inquiry. And then looking outwards, so considering then what does that mean for the ways in which we design and deliver services. And that goes beyond making spaces look beautiful and comfortable for children and families. It's also about looking at, for example, protocols around pain management for children, including neonates. So recognizing that children feel pain too. And then we take a step even further out to consider the social determinants of health. And we encourage students to go out into their communities, to do a home visit, to start to forge partnerships with other departments that are responsible for service delivery, because we know that the burden is really driven by the broader determinants of health. And then finally, we encourage students to become advocates, to hold government accountable, to use their voice to speak with and for children. You can see that here we're using children's rights not simply in a legalistic way, but as a language of critique and a language of possibility. And what we're trying to do with the course is to shift students from a deficit and problem-centered approach to one of appreciative inquiry, encouraging doctors and health professionals to imagine the possibilities, to think the unthinkable, because if we're wanting to realize children's rights in the real world, we have to be visionary, we have to keep pushing the boundaries and the barriers, because rights are not fixed in stone. They're not written simply into laws and policies. They're actually open-ended and expansive and need to be grounded in our practice. So we need to be continually asking, what do they mean here for this child in my context? Yeah, and then just to say that we support this through a whole series of activities that start to ground that in the practice of pediatricians. We start to build that directory of local services. We start to interrogate quality of care within their facility. And the course culminates in an advocacy project where students can tackle an issue, a burning issue of their choice. And as much as we thought that that was going to be a strategic thinking exercise, what happened in practice is most of our students have taken that work forward and achieved tangible results in the world, such as this project at Paarl Hospital, which was designed to rescue the milk bank, which was down to a single donor at the start of the project. And the pediatrician designed a pamphlet. He went out and spoke to journalists at the local paper. He set up a Facebook site to encourage donors, women who are breastfeeding out in the community, to donate breast milk for more vulnerable children. And we saw real change and the breast milk bank starting to thrive. So when we start to engage with children and we start to engage with children's rights, it starts to change the way that we see children. We start to see them for who they are, in the context where they come from, and we start to appreciate the challenges that parents have to endure. And in that process, it transforms the way that we manage children in clinical practice, the ways in which we connect them to services. And what is particularly gratifying is that the course has built the confidence of students to actually speak out and to work for children's rights. So that's it from me. I'm sorry if I went on a little bit over my time, but I just wanted to show that, in a sense, change happens not only from the top down, but equally important from the bottom up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was very interesting. Dr. Omar, you can present the slides now.
Okay. Is my slides appear? I'm just checking. Are my slides appearing?
No, I can only see you.
Okay, let me go back. Let me just see what's going on. 1 second. Okay. Go back. Is it appearing now?
Yes, I can see it now.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. And thank you to Wits and Adler Museum for this great opportunity. After Laurie has spoken, I actually wonder how much contribution can I actually make. But just for everybody to understand that the Teddy Bear Foundation has been in existence since 1986, and we work with victims of child abuse, all forms of abuse, whether it's neglect, sexual, physical, emotional, corporal punishment, child trafficking, children who have experienced online exploitation, child sex offenders. We have a partnership with Charlotte Matseke where we have a medical child abuse clinic for children specifically, and we have psychosocial supportive services, psychological assessments, and we do a lot of community outreach with learners at schools, even with communities having dialogues, doing a lot of gender-based violence, and more so since COVID-19 hit our shores, we realized that we cannot work without the mothers or the females, adult females that are affected by domestic violence, because it impacts on the well-being of children, regardless of the fact of whether they are direct or indirect victims. The long-term implications are quite severe and impacts on the trajectory of many children, affecting their neural pathways, affecting their behaviors, and often addressing the labeling of children, because behind that bad or mad child, there's usually a very sad child. So just an overview and why we're focusing on gender-based violence, because we know that violence against children and violence against women falls under the ambit of gender-based violence and femicide. And we are aligned as the Teddy Bear Foundation to the National Strategic Plan. And looking at the 10-year period from 2020 to 2030, what is the vision? So we want to see a nation, a country, actually a world free from gender-based violence directed at women and children and the LGBTQIA+ community. The 6 pillars that emerged in the National Strategic Plan, and I think it's important just to sketch the landscape so people start understanding the work we do, because it's so aligned and resonates with the 6 pillars in terms of accountability, prevention and rebuilding social cohesion, justice, safety and protection. Pillar 4, response, care and support. Pillar 5 looks at economic empowerment. And pillar 6, research and information management. So in terms of accountability, yes, we are direct service providers as the Teddy Bear Foundation. We're working within the Gauteng province. We also have a partnership with UNICEF in the Eastern Cape and KZN, where we are focusing specifically on SRHR and bodily autonomy, working with young children and adolescents. But accountability is something that we are often finding that it's the very systems that are, well, the systems that are supposed to protect our children are failing our children, and holding people accountable for failing to deliver, lack of adequate delivery or lack of appropriate responses where they respond, but the responses are definitely victimizing the victims further, the secondary trauma that is induced on the victims and their families. The second pillar, we do a lot of prevention work in terms of our community outreach, the awareness raising, making children aware of their rights and responsibilities, where to access support, how to access support, Also, looking at crime prevention, because many children are falling prey to becoming perpetrators of violence. So again, being proactive and enabling children to appreciate that actions have consequences. And then the third pillar, speaking to justice, safety, and protection. So again, where justice is failing, law enforcement is failing our children, where reports are made and sometimes children are subjected to further trauma, the responses that are elicited by law enforcement, where children are felt to be more victimized, where they feel that they are blamed for what has happened, because the kind of questions and the lack of sensitivity that is demonstrated by these officials are not always serving the best interests of children, and sometimes prevents children from making further disclosures or continuing the justice process. So a lot of injustices that are perpetrated against children, even if we look at the court system where cases are postponed repeatedly, and I can speak to cases that we just discussed a week ago, where parents told us that cases have been postponed for 8 to 10 times this year. So the child has been removed from school each time, appearing in court and given a feeble excuse. Magistrate has recused himself. The defense, the defense person has not arrived. And there isn't an interpreter, there isn't an intermediary, and this continues repeatedly. So again, where we stand up for children, because as service providers, we look at the holistic, integrated approach to responding to children's needs, and of course, providing ongoing support, counseling, so the response care and support and containment, not only of the child, but the child belongs to a system and systems. So we would respond in reaching out to the family to enable them to continue supporting the child outside of the therapeutic context, but also where other learners or other children are involved, we would get engaged. So that ecological framework, working from a micro, meso, and macro level. And I think that's important for people to appreciate. What are we doing at a macro level? We're looking at legislation and policy, and we've made dents in legislation and policy, where if we look at the Sexual Offences Act 15 and 16, where we were instrumental in driving this to the Constitutional Court, and it was decriminalized. So, and even in terms of the statute of limitations, where we were amicus curiae, it went to the Constitutional Court, and relief was provided in favor of all, both adults and children. So there's no statute of limitations in terms of reporting. Previously, there was a statute of limitations for indecent assault, any other form of sexual assault, where there was, whereas there was no limitation on reporting rape. So I think, and if we just cast our mind to the Sydney Frankel case, where they could not open a criminal case, but they went forward and ahead, making advances on a civil suit, and this certainly impacted on legislation and policy. And then as far as research and information management, which is the last pillar for the gender-based violence, and we're having the second summit in November, but the National Strategic Plan, we do a lot of research, because research informs our interventions and it guides us on what the actual needs are, and doing a lot of monitoring and evaluation and impact studies on the programs that we run. But I also want to say that just working in the sector, the children's sector, is that there's underrepresentation of the children's sector. And as a result of that, I think there was an adoption of the NSP in including children, because we know that they are the voiceless. Their voices are never heard. They're invisible and continue to remain invisible. And if we look at the National Strategic Plan, the focus has been a lot on women. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I think children's voices have been diluted. And with regard to that, bringing in the children's sector, people like the Children's Institute, Childline, Teddy Bear Foundation, and the NACCW, and other people from the children's sector, we've actually created a platform where we are now in a position to bring children's voices to this next summit, which takes place on the 1st and 2nd of November. And we know that it's been an oversight, a short sight for a long, long period of time. So we are actually having a children's national dialogue, a children's summit where children are going to be brought in from the provinces, 4 children per province, a child ambassador from each province, accompanied by their caretakers, and it will be hosted on the 21st, 22nd of October. And we will have service providers, social workers, counselors there to contain and debrief children, but to give them a platform to share their concerns, their worries, their experiences. These are going to be children who have received supportive services, interventions, so they are beneficiaries. And we need to bring their voices to the fore to actually bring it to the platform so that they are not glossed over with hearing their solutions. What do they see as helpful, useful, and meaningful? And, what do they need to feel safe? To feel safe at school, to feel safe outside. So I think this is just, and this just reflects, this picture, or the pictures reflect the importance of children. As you can see that some of these dialogues were held during the COVID period, the Children's Parliament in 2019, and of course, UNICEF's engagement and involvement in ensuring children's rights being pursued. And currently we are working closely with UNICEF, DSD, and all people representing the children's sector. So I think just looking at this whole issue of children's development, if we just cast our mind, if we can recall the 2022 SONA address by the president. And for me, I think for many of us, it was very disappointing because the path chosen neglects children, and it failed to address children's issues, children's rights. The focus was exclusively on business. It was economic driven and little on social, civil, and political recovery. And I think, so where does the Teddy Bear Foundation fit into all of this? As I said, our role and engagement is not only on a micro level or a meso level, but on a macro level, where we fight for children's rights, where they're not validated, or children's constitutional rights are not being addressed. We certainly propagate that they are given that platform. And being in the interim steering committee of the National Strategic Plan, I felt quite overwhelmed, overpowered by women-led, feminist-led organizations who were fighting and promoting and propagating women's rights. And it was there that I think we took a strong stand with the support of the few institutions I've identified that we need to bring children's rights to the fore. So that is where the Teddy Bear Foundation has come from. And I think spending the past 4 years since 2018, it has certainly come to fruition to unlock the development and potential of our country's greatest growing asset, which is our children. And the president emphasized that the focus will be on the same priorities as in the previous year in the SONA address: overcoming the COVID pandemic, a massive rollout of infrastructures, substantial increase in local production, the employment stimulus, and of course, the energy crisis, the rapid expansion of that. But if we look at the mention of children, it's actually so disappointing. It's actually, one cannot even describe the emotions we experienced. Just quoting the president, many children still have to brave overflowing rivers to reach schools. And this, of course, is a reflection of the Eastern Cape, Lutsikisiki, and many other areas, under-resourced, disadvantaged communities. And that was the only mention of children in the whole SONA address. And our greatest asset are our children. So just to understand and appreciate the value that is attributed to children on such a national platform. So children's development, the focus is only on violence against children, which is a very important issue, but equally important are children's equality and optimal development, and it's a sustainable development priority, something that we have not addressed sufficiently. And we know that 46% of sexual offenses complainants are children. Unfortunately, children are the most vulnerable, marginalized population group. And something of further concern is that no mention is made of the boy child. And the Optimus study clearly indicated boys 20% and girls 19% are victims of abuse. And the rights of boy children not being protected. That is something, that's why when we talk about, it's not violence against women and violence against girls, it's violence against children, bringing in, the boy child cannot be excluded. We've got to bring the boy child in as well. If we want to, drive it further, make progress, advance, and certainly make an impact in terms of solutions, we need to bring everybody on board. So I'll just move on. I think, so violence against children and gender-based violence are closely linked. And that is why, as the Teddy Bear Foundation, we found we cannot actually separate those two, that we have to address that. I'll move on. Working with children and working with young sex offenders, we have quite a sophisticated program since 2000 till the current period. We've developed and refined and tweaked our sex offender program for children. And something that we've actually found as compelling are the gendered norms that are entrenched at a very young age, where many of the boy children and, their understanding of sex and sexuality, their processing of their socializations, where they see it as their right to violate, they accept and have no concerns when the father figure is beating the mother, or the father figure has more than one partner, but they actually do not agree with the mother figure beating the father or having more than one partner. So their understanding and of course their roles, the prescription of roles, where it's acceptable for a female to be submissive, subdued, for the female child to, persevere with household chores and not enjoy the privileges and benefits of the boy child. So looking at drivers of gender-based violence and the kind of interventions that we provide, we work a lot with children, with young children, addressing norms and roles and rights, and going back to the socialization processes. I think this is something that we have to address in terms of the primary drivers of violence in children. And we also know that dysfunctional families certainly contributes to that, but again, we find that it's not adequately addressed. So, and education, something that is key. And just also wanted to bring to your attention, Laurie spoke about the food insecurity and the challenges and the reframe there. In terms of our macro level engagement, during the hard lockdown period, when schools were closed, it became equal to the fact, no school, no food. And we submitted affidavits, we supported early, equal education. And that was also something that we were being proactive, where the case was won in the High Court. It was, and food was immediately reinstated as an order of the court. So it's always about taking action where children's rights are not validated or it's invalidated. And in our approach, I mentioned that we do a lot of intervention. So we do prevention, early intervention, and a lot of community outreach, and it's all victim-centered, evidence-based, and it certainly addresses the drivers of gender-based violence, and we address children. So yes, we address both women and children, girls and boys, I think, and that's something that has not always been the case. Okay, and if we look at online safety and with COVID, and I'm not saying that prior to COVID-19, children were not exploited online, but many children were confined to their devices or had access to parents' devices. And we found that a lot of children were exposed to online sexual exploitation, cyberbullying. We dealt with cases of attempted suicide, and I think these are things that as Teddy Bear Foundation, we feel, as part of the pillars, the 6 pillars that I mentioned, we have to work with it. And if we look at pillar 6 in terms of research, and I'm sure Laurie will have more to say on that, but things that we've looked at and tried to identify, we have not seen sufficient research identified for children on online safety. So the challenges, I think I've already spoken to a lot of it, but I think just to also say that the National Strategic Plan needs to strengthen its focus on children. It needs a specific section on children that is child-orientated, and that children are included in this process, also ensuring that there's representation. So what do we mean? Inclusivity of boy children, girl children, children with disabilities as well. I think that is something that we cannot also gloss or neglect. And then children, once again, the most important thing, they should have a voice. And the NSP needs to have a dedicated section on children and a section that deals with the interface, because we know there's an intersectionality on violence against women and violence against children. I'm just going to move on. I think the one thing that we were faced with during COVID-19, during the pandemic, was government departments were not fulfilling their mandate. They had plans in place and referral systems in place, but when we were faced with crises and reached out to these various platforms, people were absent without leave, not able to be reached. And the reality was that it became the responsibility of civil society organizations to address the challenges on the ground. We were distributing masks in informal settlements. We were distributing food. We were going out and providing community psychology, debriefing when children witnessed rapes, or there was somebody raped in the community, or a 9-year-old committed suicide. So that was the kind of interventions as an NGO, as a civil society organization. We found ourselves having to fulfill that kind of support, which was lacking, and government was not fulfilling that mandate. I think I'll just move on. We know that it's a co-responsibility. It requires a collective effort, a collaborative effort, but we should not dismiss the fact that government has an overarching responsibility. And if the more people are brought on board, including civil society organizations who are actually on the ground, they are the barefoot community workers and in touch with the needs on the ground, that in consultation and deliberations, we can certainly make an impact and reach out to those in dire need. Just move on. Okay, before I end, I just want to say that, and with due respect, funding goes to academics, and sometimes it's, the delivery or the replication of what they research and develop on the ground is not always done. But many CSOs are doing such amazing work, are doing the real hard, cold front work, but there's no funding to test their efficacy. And I think that's something that needs to be considered and needs to be encouraged and, of course, incentivized so that more CSOs can provide a bottoms-up approach in terms of experiences, information, and adaptation of interventions. Thank you. I think I've said what I've needed to say, and we will. I want to also say that children are born, but champions are made, and it's the responsibility of each and every one of us to ensure that children are given that platform to become champions. because yes, many children are victims, are wounded, but with opportunities created, they bounce back with the force. They are resilient, and hope is just a phone call away or a short place away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Omar and Laurie, for those riveting presentations. We have a few minutes left of the series, and I'd just like to say, when Laurie spoke about that slow violence of malnutrition and how it slowly eats away at a child's potential, and then Dr. Omar also brought in the fact that children are born but champions are made, that I think we all felt that when that was said. And I do see that Stephen has typed a question in the Q&A section, but Stephen, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for those presentations. They were really interesting. And actually, I have a lot of things are going through my head right now. The one thing that was stuck with me was when Dr. Omar was talking about the consequences of this most recent pandemic and what happened during lockdown around the constellation of the household. I actually was talking to friends of mine working in the clinical space at the time, and a friend of mine who was working in a peri-urban district hospital on the outskirts of Gauteng noted that there was an increase in the number of children presenting with severe burn wounds over that period. And we couldn't necessarily say that it was due to the fact that lockdown had forced people to move back into small homes that were often overcrowded. What we couldn't say that it was necessarily attested to the social and financial challenges and perhaps a level of frustration that people were feeling, but it seemed to us pretty obvious. And it just got me thinking that there are these long lasting consequences of a few years on the early development of children. And I was wondering whether you would want to speak to that in terms of like future areas of intervention, future ways of thinking about how we address, I guess, a really shocking or fragmented moment in our country's history. If you have any thoughts on that, would be really great. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. If I can dive in first. One of the things that we did as the Advocacy Committee in the Department of Pediatrics and Child Health at GCT is very early in the COVID-19 pandemic. We had a meeting where we, based on the knowledge that we had, we imagined what the potential impacts were going to be on children. And they covered a range of things, from concerns around increased hunger and food insecurity, increased risk of violence and injury within the home. And sort of through that process, we mobilized the rest of the children's sector to initiate a conversation around how can we ensure that children's best interests are protected in a pandemic that was so largely seen as focused on adult care and safeguarding the health system. And what we did through that process is also we developed a series of advocacy briefs. And we called them advocacy briefs because, as much as they were rooted in research and administrative data and qualitative cases from the Western Cape, as much as they were evidence-based, what we recognized is that children were fundamentally overlooked, particularly within the health system. We saw children and infants separated from their mothers and families. We saw disruption of routine health services. We saw pediatric beds diverted to adult COVID care, many of which have not returned to pediatrics. So we realized that what we needed to do, these problems were happening even in the Western Cape, which is incredibly well resourced, that has a very strong active network of child health champions. Even there, we didn't have a strong enough seat or representation at the gold and the silver command level to protect children's services in a time of crisis. So I think there's a real need to learn lessons from that period, and to build this cohort of child rights champions, so that when we hit the next crisis, whether that's another pandemic or the civil unrest we saw in KZN or the floods, we need to be adopting a child-centered approach. And because children are not at the center and heart of government, they don't have a vote, they're very often not included at the table, we need to be stepping up with and on their behalf, to make sure that there is no regression. And certainly from a rights perspective, there's very, very clear guidance from the UNCRC, and it was reiterated in the National School Nutrition Program court case, that governments may not step back from their commitments to children, that there should be no regression, unless that's the very last resort, after you've considered every other option, and where children are the very last people to be affected by those regressive measures. And yet what we're seeing even now with the response to COVID-19 is we're seeing austerity kicking in, and children's, even in the US, children's wards getting shut down. So we need these champions. And I know you raised a question about champions and advocates. And yes, we need individuals, but we also need to be organizing. We need to be building more of a social movement within the arena of child health, so that there is the support for the individuals on the front line. Thank you.
Okay, I think Laurie's covered it so comprehensively, but I just will speak to the implementation that continues on the ground, Stephen, just to respond to the fact that in our outreach work with learners at schools, and so it's not only addressing the learners, but, so the SAFE programs, we always address their worries, their concerns, and we look, and I think we don't underscore the anxieties, because whilst the pandemic may be dying, I think the fears, the anxieties, the insecurities, the instability, uncertainty in their lives continue to live. And that is something that continue to address, and not only with the learners, but certainly with the educators, on identifying signs and symptoms of children suffering from anxiety or manifesting behavioral disorders, and how to manage, where to refer. I think we don't expect educators to be therapists or counselors, but to be able to be in a position to say that this child is in need, this child is disturbed, or this child needs support or professional intervention, and where can they refer the child to. And even in our community dialogues, where we have dialogues with people in faith-based settings, in other community settings, where we get invited and invite ourselves to engage with people. But as Laurie indicated, we need to organize ourselves. I think it's not just working in isolation and pockets of excellence being rolled out. We need to organize ourselves so that we have an overall and coordinated, comprehensive, integrated approach to ensuring the safety and protection of children, and ensuring that children's rights are not overlooked, but certainly addressed in an appropriate and adequate manner. Thank you.
And perhaps just a quick note that I've added a link to the COVID-19 advocacy briefs in the Q&A. If anyone's interested in reading more about the Western Cape experience, and if things were bad in the Western Cape, it's definitely probably worse in other parts of the country. And we're really hoping that these briefs could be used as tools for child rights champions, wherever they're located in the health system, to give them the evidence base and the confidence to speak up on children's behalf.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions that our attendees would like to ask?
I have a question. I have a couple of questions.
Go
Do we have
ahead,
enough time
Mkanyezi.
for more questions? Okay.
Well, maybe 1 or 2 questions.
Okay. So my first question is for both Lori and Dr. Uma, was that I heard you guys speak about working together. This includes the community, students, and everyone else. Do you think that are we exposing our children to danger when we now give access to a lot of people, when we give a lot of people access to them, especially children who are victims of abuse and their mothers as well? Do you think we are exposing danger to them, and how can we protect them from getting attacked, maybe from other community members? And my second question is, how do we protect the people who speak out? This is for Dr. Uma. How do we protect the people who speak out against GBV? Because you find that we can report this to the police, but then the very same person who reported this, the abuse, will then come back into the same environment where the abuser is. So how do we protect the people who speak out, not only the victims, but also the witnesses? And how do we also protect children who are deemed to be illegal in the system, maybe came here from illegally through our system? How do we have any measures to protect those children and to take them up into our system and also make sure that they are protected, seeing as children, they are innocent? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I'll answer the question first of children who are, you raised something very important that we face all the time, where children come face to face with the alleged perpetrator, even after making a disclosure, even after a case is opened. How do we protect these children? And something that we have been faced with regularly, ongoing, where children and families are subjected to this kind of victimization. So of course, ensuring that the protection orders are in place, supporting them in contacting law enforcement, because often there's a fear of law enforcement officers as well. The kind of responses that are received by victims and their families are not always favorable. So it is something that is an ongoing battle and that we continue fighting. We escalate it. We've been to media, we've been to station commanders, cluster commanders, so we cannot give up. I'm not saying it's going to go away, but again, when we look at accountability, we have to continue holding people accountable, and also look at other supportive measures of how can we contain the child who has made the disclosure and support the child through this process without subjecting the child to any further trauma. Lori, do you want to add anything to that?
No, not from my side. Thanks, Sheila.
And then the other thing is that we find, you say exposing children to many different people. So it's again teaching children healthy boundaries, because often the boundaries are blurred and violation occurs when the boundaries are blurred. So making children appreciate from a very young and tender age, from the time that they've developed vocabulary about acceptable and unacceptable behaviors, about safe and unsafe touches, demonstrating that to them so that they understand, they process what is allowed, what is not allowed, and that it's okay for them to say no. And, I'm not a proponent of teaching children to say no and shouting out for help. Unfortunately, because of the challenges that children face, we're finding ourselves in a position where we have to tell children that it's okay to say no. So even with young children and even older children in our SRHR, Sexual Reproductive Health and Rights, we speak about bodily autonomy, even in dating relationships where it's okay to say no, addressing their self-esteem, and what, what does it mean if you say no, and how is it going to affect the relationship, and appreciating that they have rights, that everybody has rights, and those rights need to be executed. But again, we use age-appropriate language depending on the ages and stages of development of children. And it's not just exposing them to all and sundry and throwing them out to the wolves. We also, I think we go through strict and stringent vetting processes where people who are providing these interventions and supportive services go through the screening before they're actually allowed to engage or, work with children. Thank you. I'm not sure if I've answered your questions.
I just wanted to also thank Shahida just for highlighting the relationship between children's right to protection on the one hand and their right to participation. And very often as parents, when children are very young, we're very vigilant, we're focused on care and protection. And there's a really important shift that needs to happen in terms of parenting, to enable, well, parenting and also in terms of health professional education that enables children to have a voice, to create a space that is warm and supportive and welcoming, and that respects children's views. And I think that's one of the key ingredients that's been so transformational in our child rights courses. Many of the doctors have talked about it's as if they have had sunglasses on for their whole lives, and suddenly the glasses come off, and that's because they have listened to a child describe their experiences within the health system, and they've suddenly for the first time recognized just how competent and capable young people are. So there's, I think, a really important shift that needs to happen at every level of society. That respects what children have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurie and Dr. Omar, and thank you for engaging, to our attendees as well, for engaging in this very rich discussion that we had. I'd just like to, again, thank our speakers today, Dr. Omar and Laurie Lake, for joining us, and for everyone that is in the audience, I should say, for joining us for our last Can Do Comedian session. If you would like to catch up on previous sessions that we had, or look at the research that our speakers have done and are currently doing, please visit the Wits Where To site. Our next podcast series will begin again next year, so please look out for notifications on that. And with that, I know that we are 3 minutes over time. Thank you once again, and have a pleasant week further. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.